Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's Science Café, hosted by the Weiss School of Natural Sciences in partnership with the Consulate General of France in Houston and the Rice Space Institute. I'm Tom Killian, Dean of Natural Sciences here at Rice, and I also recognize Valérie Berben, Consul General of France, and also David Alexander, the Director of the Rice Space Institute. Scientific discovery inspires curiosity and it lays the foundations for tomorrow's technological revolutions. The Science Café is a wonderful opportunity to share the excitement of scientific discovery at Rice with the general public. And we also use it to build stronger relationships with the community and between Rice's talented faculty and students and all of our alumni and friends. I'm delighted that you're all here this evening. And it's my pleasure to introduce our two presenters. The first is Scott Solomon. He's an associate teaching professor of biosciences at Rice University, and his current research examines the interactions between native and non-native ant species, the impacts of extreme flooding on ant communities, ant foraging behavior, and the coevolution of ants and microbes. He's also a talented communicator. He's the author of the book Future Humans: Inside the Science of Our Continuing Evolution, as well as a forthcoming book about how living in space will affect the human body and mind. At Rice, he teaches courses in ecology, evolutionary biology, and scientific communication, and he often speaks and writes about science at schools, museums, churches, and other venues. Karim Oyarzabal is a French artist, illustrator, comic book author, former stage actor, and theater producer. He was raised as an engineer and graduated from the famous French École Polytechnique. He loves math, movies, and people, and currently, Karim is in Houston for a Via Albertine artist residency supported by the French Consulate and the Rice Space Institute. So let's thank our speakers for this evening. And first up will be Scott Solomon.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here, and also want to just quickly say happy birthday to Dean Tom Killian. Thanks for choosing to share your birthday with us, Tom. It's a real delight to be here. I always enjoy these Science Cafe events, and it's really wonderful to get to share this particular event with the French Consulate and with Karim. If we can get our technology going here. Well, I can always advance. Nope, I can't advance. There we go. All right. And we're back. Okay. So as you heard from the introduction, I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, and my current interest is in thinking about what our future in space might mean for our future as a species. I wanted to start off with two very famous quotes about our future in space. People have been thinking and dreaming and imagining a future that involves people spreading out from Earth out into the cosmos for a great long time. One of the pioneers of rocketry and aeronautics, the Russian Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, once said that Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot stay in the cradle forever. Likewise, famous astrophysicist, theoretical physicist Stephen Hawking pointed out that eventually our long-term chance of surviving is not to remain here inward-looking on planet Earth, but to spread out into space. And that is the premise for the talk that I want to share with you, and my starting point as an evolutionary biologist to think through what the consequences of those two statements might be. In other words, if we do indeed choose to leave Earth, or some of us choose to leave Earth, and to create bases, settlements, cities perhaps, beyond our own planet, what does that mean for the people who live in those places? What would that mean for future generations of Martians? What should we expect to happen to them and their children? So just to kind of put this in perspective, I want to share kind of briefly where we are right now in this moment in space exploration and our sort of efforts to make this a reality. We have been traveling to space for more than 6 decades. For more than 23 years, there has been a continuous human presence in space. Since November of the year 2000, there have continuously been human beings living and working on the International Space Station. It's just interesting to me to reflect on that for just a moment, because we talk about a future in space very often as this hypothetical, very futuristic scenario. But in many ways, that scenario is already happening. We already are living in space. Just a few of us, but the numbers are increasing. And of course, we've learned quite a bit about how to make it easier to get to space and what happens to us when we go to space. But beyond that, there has long been an interest in having a more permanent foothold in space by creating a base, a station, or perhaps even a home, a city elsewhere. And the current efforts to do that are focused first on the moon to create lunar bases. Efforts to do that are already happening right now as we speak, and eventually on Mars, as the closest planet that has the resources that we would need to be able to actually sustain a human presence without needing constant resupply from Earth. When I first started thinking about what the biological implications for that could be, this still seemed very much like a hypothetical future scenario. But the efforts to make that happen are already underway. So down in South Texas on the island of Boca Chica, there is, as we speak, a launch pad with SpaceX's latest craft on it called Starship, which with funding from NASA is designed to carry large numbers of people and supplies to the moon and onward to Mars. And as you may know, they've been testing this rocket, and each launch has done progressively better. And just last month, during spring break, I went down to South Texas with 2 of my children, and we personally witnessed the latest launch attempt, which was the first successful launch for Starship to actually reach space. And it was incredible to get to witness that in person and to recognize sort of how far humanity has come with its efforts to make these futuristic visions a reality. So again, my starting point here is, what if that is all successful? What if it works? What if we actually could surmount all of the challenges that would come with creating a permanent human settlement on Mars? How would people living on Mars be affected by the conditions on Mars? How can we think about what would happen to their bodies and their minds? This idea fascinates me, and it's what I'm currently working on, as Dean Killian mentioned, for a book for MIT Press. And being in Houston, honestly, is the ideal place to be to try to ask these questions. The number of people that I have met, including some folks here in the room, who have helped me to sort of learn what is going on in the world right now when it comes to space science and space exploration, space medicine, how we can put all of these pieces together to try to answer these questions. For me, if we want to ask about our evolutionary future, we need to first understand our evolutionary past. How can we use our history of evolution to give us practical insight into where we might be headed under different future scenarios? In order to understand our past, One of the ways that we can do that is to look to the fossil record. And I had an incredible opportunity last summer to go to Tanzania and visit a colleague of mine from the anthropology department here at Rice, Manuel Dominguez Rodrigo, who is overseeing excavations at Olduvai Gorge, which is one of the most famous and important sites anywhere in the world for finding fossils of humans and other animals that help us to kind of piece together the story of human evolution. And so one of the things I got to do when I visited last summer is to help participate in an excavation, the one you see here on the left, where his team was actually excavating a 1.8 million year old elephant. And that elephant had been butchered by humans. The stone tool marks were still on the bones, we could see them, and the stone tools were still there. It gave me chills. It still gives me chills just to be able to think about the consequences of being able to see that in person, right? But here's the thing. These were humans in a sense, but it wasn't our species. This was not Homo sapiens that was butchering this elephant. 1.8 million years ago, our species didn't exist yet. This was a different species. They're trying to figure out still exactly which species it was. It was a type of human, but not us. And so the lessons that we can learn from the excavations that teams like this are doing in places like Olduvai Gorge are telling us an important story. They're telling us that the history of our species is one of adaptation and resilience and the ability to cope with changing conditions. Because what they know from the work here is that the conditions in this place were never constant, they were always changing. And what we see in the species that survived was that they were able to adapt. And how did they do that? Well, partly through their intelligence and ingenuity, and partly through biological evolution, biological change through natural selection. And so at the end of the day, we are a very, very adaptable species. We are very, very good at coping with new conditions through our intelligence, through our culture, and also biologically. So that, of course, has important implications for thinking about moving into a place like Mars that, of course, has a very, very dramatically different environment. At the same time, if we want to understand that process, how does natural selection actually operate? How would that translate into evolutionary change on Mars? Well, for that, the Galapagos Islands is, of course, the most sort of quintessential place to study the process of evolution. And not only because it inspired Charles Darwin to develop his theory of evolution by natural selection, but also because it continues to be a living laboratory for the study of the process of evolution. So the very same finches that Darwin discovered and documented and used as an example in his book on the origin of species are still being used today by biologists to piece together how evolution works. And so we now know, for example, that the 14 species of Galapagos finches can trace their evolutionary history back to just one species that arrived on the Galapagos Islands less than 2 million years ago. And what happened then? Well, part of it was isolation, being isolated on an island, isolated from the mainland population that they came from. And part of it was that the conditions on the Galapagos Islands were different from the conditions where they came from. So isolation and different environmental conditions leads to natural selection. And what is the result? This explosion of diversity. From one species, we get 14. We call that adaptive radiation. They're adapting and they're radiating out into a variety of different species. And we think islands are the ideal situation for this to take place because of those factors, isolation and dramatically different environments. So, sound familiar? Right? Okay, I got to, I've been lucky to be able to visit the Galapagos Islands a number of times. It's actually the place where I decided I wanted to become a biologist as an undergraduate. The most recent time was with a group of Rice alumni as part of the Traveling Owls program. And we went to a lot of amazing places on that trip. This was probably not most people's favorite. It's not the most beautiful looking island you've ever seen, but I was pretty much losing my mind as we went past this, because if you're an evolutionary biologist, this is one of the most famous places in the world. This is an island called Daphne Major. And the reason it's so famous is that this is the site of a recent study in evolutionary biology by, the couple shown here in the bottom left photo. This is Peter and Rosemary Grant. They've dedicated their careers to studying the finches on this one island. And what they were able to show is not only over millions of years do you see natural selection leading to evolutionary change, but that it actually can happen in just 1 year. In just 1 year, you can see noticeable changes in the size and shape of the beaks of the finches on this island. So the very idea that Darwin had that maybe over eventually, long periods of time, maybe we can get evolutionary change, yes, and it happens much faster than we used to think. So again, islands, isolation, different environments. This is an image of what the Galapagos Islands looks like. But to me, when I think about the planets in our solar system, I think about islands. After all, they are isolated masses that are separated by inhospitable space, right? That's what an island is too, if you're a finch, or another thing. So I've talked about evolutionary change. I've said that we see that it can happen faster than was once thought. There's really two main factors, though, that influence how quickly it happens. And I think this is really important for thinking through what our future in space might be like, because we know that the strength of natural selection, when it's stronger, evolution happens faster. When would natural selection be stronger? The harsher the environment, the more different the environment is from how it used to be, the stronger selection is, and therefore the faster it operates. So the more different the environment. At the same time, natural selection has to take whatever genetic variation exists in a population, and it allows whatever the variations are that are working in the environment, they get passed to the next generation. Those that aren't working as well don't pass through. So if you have a lot of genetic variation, that should mean that, again, evolution happens more rapidly. So just quickly, let's think through the difference between our home planet and Mars. On our home planet, we have a gravitational field that we define as 1g, because that's what we're used to. So 1g compared to about 1/3 of that gravity on Mars. That's a very different environment. At the same time, we have a relatively thick atmosphere here that thankfully allows us to breathe. It also shelters us and shields us from a certain amount of radiation in space. But what's especially important is our magnetic field, the Earth's magnetosphere, that is also acting like a barrier to protect us from space radiation. Mars has a very thin atmosphere and it has no magnetic shield. What does that mean? It means space radiation hits the surface at nearly full strength. What does radiation do to our bodies? One of the main things it does is it damages DNA. That's why it can cause cancer. But mutations are ultimately the source of all genetic variation. So if you've got higher radiation exposure, that means you're actually going to increase the mutation rate. That means more raw material available for natural selection in a dramatically different environment. And what that means at the end of the day is we should expect evolution to happen very, very rapidly for anybody that's able to survive on the surface of Mars. So one of the things I'm trying to do right now in my work is to try to ask, okay, we understand how evolution works. We can apply those principles as I've just described. But we also need to ask, what do we know about how space affects the human body? And this is where we can draw on these decades of research that's been done by folks, including folks working in this building and across the street, to help us to understand the conditions in space and how they impact the human body and mind. You might be familiar with the NASA twins study, astronauts Scott Kelly and Mark Kelly. Scott Kelly spent nearly a year on the International Space Station while his brother Mark stayed on Earth. That was just one example of the incredible amount of information we've been able to derive about how specifically the body is affected by lower gravity and by higher radiation and other conditions in space. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail about sort of how I think about that affecting people on Mars, but I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A if anybody is interested. It's not just people actually going to space, though. One of the things that's amazing, and again, things that are really cool that we can see here in the Houston area, there's so much research using Earth-based analogs for space. In other words, simulations of space conditions like the Neutral Buoyancy Lab just down the road near Johnson Space Center, where the world's largest swimming pool is a simulator for what a lower gravity environment is like, where astronauts can train and tests can be conducted. At the same time, there is the NASA Space Radiation Lab. I had an opportunity to visit last year. This is on Long Island at Brookhaven National Lab, where simulated galactic cosmic rays, which when I first heard that term, I thought it was a made-up term. It sounds like something out of a comic book, but there really is a galactic cosmic ray simulator there where they're able to simulate space radiation in order to ask in a controlled environment, how does that radiation affect living things and DNA. And then the last thing is other types of analogs, like, for example, the HERA analog, which is at Johnson Space Center, where crews of people have signed up to go and spend a specified amount of time in a simulated space habitat so that we can better understand how crews of people work together, how stress affects the dynamics between these groups, and how they would handle different situations. So we can start to think about what is the right kind of combination of people that we need to select for such a mission, and what are the ways that we can maximize their chances of success. So the HERA facility at NASA's Johnson Space Center is one example of that, and there are others around the world, including the Mars Desert Research Station in Utah, which very much looks like Mars, but is just in Utah. And then Biosphere 2 in Arizona, which was really one of the world's first attempts at doing this on a large scale and creating an enclosed ecosystem. I'll be traveling there next month for an analog astronaut conference where I'm excited to learn from people that are doing these types of simulations about what the main takeaways are for them. So just to kind of wrap this up and turn things over to Karim, for me, as an evolutionary biologist, I'm very interested in thinking about how can we use science to make predictions about what the future would be like for people under these different scenarios. And of course, I'm sure you're all very familiar with all sorts of depictions from science fiction about what Martians might look like. Going back to H.G. Wells's the famous The War of the Worlds, in which the Martians came and they had this sort of almost octopus-like body with long tentacles and squishy heads. As time has progressed, we have gotten progressively more humanoid in our depiction of what Martians might look like. Going to some of the pulp fiction of the 1940s and early 1950s, and up to and including modern versions and depictions, like, for example, The Expanse, which some of you might be familiar with, which very much tries to draw on evolutionary principles and our understanding of how space affects the human body to think through how people might be affected by these conditions. So I'm quite interested in thinking about how do we visualize this? How do we envision what the future might be like for these people? And that is why I'm particularly excited to hear from Karim and to be working with him in his efforts to try to think through how do we visualize this kind of future. So with that, I'll say thanks, and I will turn things over to Karim, and I think we will save our questions for the very end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Bonjour. I'm very happy to be here, and specifically in Houston, when we're talking about space, because there's no place, no other place in the world where there is such a density of people involved into space. When I arrived the 1st of February of this year, I felt like I was arriving in front of a deep, very dense and highly populated forest where everybody on each corner of each tree was doing something about space. And what I intend to do here is to take you through the journey I've been over the last 2 months that I've gone through. The part which, as an artist, interests me is not only the art form, because the art form doesn't exist without you. without the people who are viewing it or listening to the music or reading the book. And in between the spectators, the readers, and the art form, there is an immaterial concept, which is something is happening, and something is happening different from each of you. When you see this character, everybody has a different reaction. It drives you to a specific kind of thought, which and the collective thoughts together makes what is very interesting for me as an art form. I used to be an actor, and the thing I liked about being an actor is when at the end of the performance, the public would come and say, "Oh, you made me think about that, you made me think about that." And the important part is while we were crafting the play, our intention was not this one. So they were seeing something else that we were seeing. So this maybe could be your Martian. So that's maybe that's what you see, and that's actually when I arrived here, I was helped by the David Alexander and Hugh Gambezal from the Rice Space Institute to connect with a few people. Scott Salomon, I was directed pretty quickly to Scott Salomon. We had a chat very early on the process, and he invited me to one of his classes whereby the students were asked to draw what would be the Martians. So that's my test. That's for you. This is the first drawing I made last June, just a month after I've been awarded the residency where I'm currently now. And this is coming just out of 1 month of reading about space, meeting a few people. It's a pretty conventional setup, but it has already a few parts of myself. So that was the idea I had here. I would break down this. So there are many things going on in this drawing. There are two things I would break down. I started by the departures part, which while I was reading all the sovereignty issues that were arisen on the moon, gave me the idea of this part. And the second part, which is basically all the humans, and specifically the two ones that will come back later, in front of the moon, which are discussing, I don't know whether are discussing the preparation of the next holiday or their breakup, but that's up to you to decide. And this is what the state of mind I had when I came here. Why the hell are we going in space? And so as I was following down the path of my journey, so for me, I'll come back here. Within this helmet, you can have anybody. You can have an animal, you can have a human being, you can have a turtle. And that's who I see. So most of the time, my characters are women. And we'll see that because I don't know whether I mentioned that or not, but what I'm concentrated here is to go to one drawing. I'm interested to show you one image and the journey I took to arrive to this image. So, and this was sketches I was doing while I was here and meeting people. So when I arrived in Houston, the first thing that it happened the week where NASA was hosting the Human Research Exploration Conference, whereby all the scientists around the world were gathering together, discussing what the hell are we going to do on space and how does it affect us. So I had about 100 presentations per day, 10-minute speeches, very interesting. And it was pretty scary. So this is about the fluid shifts. As you know, when we are in microgravity, our bodies turn upside down, we have pressure on the brain, and we have a disc edema, and we don't see anything. So this is about a radiation. So if you think about reincarnating into a mouse, just think twice, because we use them to understand how radiations affect our system. We realize that the mouse women react differently from the mouse men, that they are less scared, that they're more resistant. So while I was working through the poster conference, I was seeing words like cancer, like degenerative tissues. That was what that's the path I was going through. And then I decided to meet with those people who went to space and to discuss these issues. When you meet somebody, so an astronaut in that case, to raise the issues of how did they feel about the difficult aspects, it's a delicate topic. So the way I would conduct the interviews would be to relocate them in the time where, by the end of the day, after their busy days, having done all the scientific experiences, their 2 hours workout, they would get into their private space, they would turn the zip, and I would ask them, what would you do then? So I had a different answer for each of them. And the other question which I was interested in, were they able to sleep well? This is the drawing I made as a thank you note to Leroy Chow, which I spent more than close to 2 hours discussing about his stays in space. He was very open, very friendly. And when the key takeout I had from this meeting was, I never met an astronaut, so those guys are commandos. So they trained for 3 years and a half to stay 6 months in space. So somehow the fact of being affected, that their body is affected and seriously affected, is not a big concern to them, because for them the mission is the utmost of the utmost importance, and that's what is the concern for them. And Leroy, he was about to finish his 6 months period, and he had a call from mission control, whereby we're going to ask you to stay 6 months more. And the main reason was because somebody down on Earth was able to pay enough to have a personal trip, and we need somebody to host this person for 6 months. He felt very angry. He was suddenly, he changed his, the way he viewed himself. He didn't view himself as somebody conducting a mission, but as an object for somebody else. So he had a very tense discussion with mission control, but he had to keep the order on. Eventually, the irony of the situation was that at the last minute, the person who was supposed to fly on space decided not to go. So this is as absurd as it is, and that tells a lot about how serious the astronauts conduct their missions. So that was not a scientific point of view, and it started to be much more interesting for me. The second astronaut I met was Terry Wirtz, also a person very open, very happy, very energetic. And he said to me, every time I was flying on the top of Argentina, I had white sparkles appearing on my brain, on my eyes. And it took me time to understand, but when I learned that when unfortunately on Earth somebody has a brain tumor, and when they are treated with radiations, so you put the head on a helmet, and you are bombarded with radiations to try to calm down the tumor, they also see those white sparkles. And when you are on top of Argentina, you are exactly at this specific spot whereby there is a weak point from the magnetosphere, which is protecting us from the radiations from the cosmic, either the deep space radiations or the solar radiations. And those radiations affect the ISS, arriving to the ISS, and that's where it has the radiations arriving on the optical nerve and give the white sparkles. The nice thing about that is that he was very happy to see the sparkles. And that's really the key takeout I had again from this meeting, that we live to experience things. Whatever relationship we have in life destroys us a bit, but we get the taste of life out of that. And that's my takeout on this one. So I was continuing my journey, and I met with 2 other astronauts. So then, this is I understand that when you fly above, so at 400 kilometers, which was the case for those astronauts, you tend to be very humble when you watch down at the Earth. And the night part of it, it's much more dramatic than the day one. when you go through Africa, it's called the dark continent because there is not much electricity. When you go over South Korea, you see the dark light is North Korea. And then you tend to realize that the conflicts we have downstairs, so rise above, and both told me, so both, which is Anna Fisher and Chang Diaz, over North Korea, you feel the absurdity of our human condition. And Anna told me what we should do is we should take the top leaders of on Earth, send them on space to do 1 or 2 tours, and in case they don't get more humble, to lead them on space. This is another angle I met through the journey, which is the debris situation. So, and again, I talk too fast, so I'm trying to slow down. What I'm trying to take you through is the journey I've been through. I've been meeting people more or less randomly. So some were explaining me technical stuff, some human stuff. And in the end, this is the process whereby an artist fills his brain with data, whatever type of data it is, and then comes out something out of that. I want to extend myself the point into debris. I assisted to a conference given by where Hugo was one of the key speakers, and we spoke at length about that. It's very strange to imagine that it's very busy already up there. I was amazed by mission control. When I started that I knew that Houston was going to be a center of space, this is again something unique here. I know you realized it, but it's so strong. I met many other companies. I met Intuitive Machines, I met Axiom, and I met Collins Aerospace, and those are only the big names of the market. And overall, the region transpires space. In France, we have the region of Toulouse, which is already pretty invested into that, but there is nothing to compare with what is happening here. For me, mission control symbolizes the heart of this center, and so this is a few sketches I made while I was there. In the middle of the turmoil of those 3 months, the 2 months and a half, which were, again, very interesting and very rewarding, I had a few days to draw. So I guess the main of my drawing will come after once I leave the residency. But then I draw two murals. So I had the project for 2 murals. The first one, I draw it this weekend. And if you have a chance to come at the opening of the exhibition next Friday at the French consulate, you will be able to see this specific mural, which is not space related. And there are also other drawings which are space related. But the one drawing I wanted to show you is this one. So when I started to draw this, this is a 200 inches by, it's roughly no, it's about the size of the mural, slightly smaller. When I started to draw this mural, I was, the prompt I have was, draw anything you want about space. So basically in that context, I layer down, that's the way I work. So I put a first intention. The first intention I put was the 2 astronauts. So this comes from the first drawing where we had two people in front of the moon. So I changed it more clearly into a romantic relationship, which is at any stage. And then I added this situation where everybody is watching at this So that's the difficulty of comment. I'm commenting something I draw, which is I can take you through process. I can not take you through meanings, apart the meaning which I intended to portray, which is for me the core of what I'm interested to is these people. Is basically those two ones. These for me represent humanity. Humanity is how we deal with the other one. It comes back when you have the astronauts flying on top of North Korea. They say, how do we come to that situation? And the rest of the people, so is us, are watching those two guys to know where they are going to head at. Are they going to separate? Are they going to be together? Are they going to fight? And each of the characters represent, that's for me a face of humanity. You may remind the drawing of the first lady on top of the right. It came throughout the process of this section. If you see to this lady which has a cross and some books with her, this is a drawing I made 2 years ago when I was in Paris. I very often go outside in the street and sketch people. And this drawing made me an impression at the time. I redraw this lady and put it on a folder on my at home. So it came back, but it came back through my mind. That's the process. The three ones you see here downstairs, those three ones were also drawn while I was in Paris in a garden, and I was sketching people lying down. And those one in particular were of interest to me. For me, when I see a conversation like that, I have histories come into my mind, so I put them on a piece of paper. The one on the left is an extract from a painting from the Spanish painter Velázquez, from the painting Las Meninas. Actually, in the painting, she's looking at us, and here she's looking at the two characters on there. And as you see there, and you have the ferry, the first one I showed you, which could be anybody else in between a human being and something else. And the ferry, as the two cats, are just staring at us, saying, what do you think about that? Lastly, and as you see, there are many books, and this is a big source of inspiration for me. And I illustrate, but I write comic books, which means words are important for me. And this is an extract from the start of a French novel from the writer Marcel Proust. And what it is said on those words is basically, for a long time, I've been to bed very early. And as soon as the candle would turn off, I would start to, my eyes would close so quickly that I wouldn't have time to say to myself, I am sleeping. And for me, that's the dream I see. That's a dream image that came out of my mind naturally after those 2 months and a half where I met quite a lot of different people. And that's what I wanted to say.
All right. So we are happy to take questions for our speakers. I will bring the mic around so that we can hear on.
Karim, what did astronauts tell you when you asked them if they slept well in the ISS?
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. That's a very good question, because I was expecting something and I got something else. And actually, you get the personality of the people when they answer to you. For instance, Leroy Chow told me, no, it's easy. I just put myself in this position, I let the things flow, and I sleep. And Leroy Chow is a workaholic. When he goes into that place, when he after the end of the day and he zips his part, he opens his computer and he starts to read book about science, about what happens in the day, and he recollects data. He's a fighter. So that was the answer for this one. As far as Terry Wirtz is concerned, This is a different kind of fighter. He says, I never sleep more than 4 hours a day, even on Earth. So there I would sleep 4 hours, and that's just a mission. So that's fine for me. So this is the kind of answers I had. There was one which is Chang Diaz. Chang Diaz never stayed very long on space. He was building the ISS, and he was staying about 2 weeks every time. But it's been he's been doing those missions of 2 weeks like throughout 10 years of time. And what he was doing, he said, no, I was not sleeping. I was just watching the Earth, and I was seeing the evolution of the pollution throughout the time, and see the conflicts. So he had a very so his personality is pretty sad somehow and pretty dark. So that when I asked the question, that was the kind of answers I had.
So Scott, as an evolutionary biologist, you briefly showed Scott and Mark Kelly alluding to some conclusions that you'd prefer to share during Q&A. This is your prompt.
Thank you for that question. I didn't plant the question, just so you know. I appreciate the question. Yes, so what are the conclusions? Well, I will say, first of all, still working on it. But here, I'll give you some previews. So we know a few things, right? We know that being in lower gravity environments causes bones to weaken, become more brittle, causes muscles to weaken, and that's why resistance exercise is so important for astronauts to do. So we can start with that and ask, what would that mean for people, say, who were living on Mars? Well, it's one thing for an adult human who is in, top physical fitness to go into a lower gravity environment. And we know how to sort of minimize the changes to their body through the various measures that have been put into place for low Earth orbit. To me, the more interesting question is, what happens to a child who is born into that environment, and how does their body develop? And for this, we actually know very little because it's never been done, at least not in humans. The other thing that we don't yet know is, what about a partial gravity environment, right? So we know, obviously, quite a bit about 1G. We've learned quite a bit about 0G, or weightlessness of low Earth orbit. What about the partial gravity of the moon or Mars? And there, the short answer is, we don't know. But we can imagine that probably it's better than 0G. The question then becomes, would a child who is born in that, say, 1/3 gravity environment, would they be able to grow a skeleton and a muscular system that would be okay? Would it be enough to get them into adulthood? Let's suppose that it does. Then the question is, could they come back to Earth? And to me, that's a really, really interesting and a super important question to think through, because if the answer is no, if their bodies would develop in such a way where maybe they could tolerate being on Mars and they could function, but they couldn't come back to Earth, then you've not only created some moral and ethical dilemmas, but you've set up a situation where that isolation that I was talking about, that we know is important for evolution, is being reinforced, because it becomes much more difficult for people to move back and forth between these two places, right? So to me, if the answer is that no, a child born on Mars can't come back to Earth, that would further drive that evolutionary divergence. And that's one of a number of reasons why I think that if we created a settlement on Mars that could sustain life independently and for multiple generations, it would eventually lead us towards a new species of human evolving on Mars.
Well, you sort of answered my second question, but on that finch experiment, you said evolution due to rapid. What really caused? I mean, did a finch from another island fly over there and they were forced? I mean, was the condition so different that they were forced into rapid evolution?
Very good. So the short version of what happened with the finches, so we know that the ancestor of the 14 species arrived in the Galapagos Islands. It was a different environment from mainland South America that they came from. So what happened over time is that they would adapt to the localized changes. And one example of that adaptation has to do with their beaks. So the finches eat a lot of seeds, and the ability to crush a seed and to eat the edible part in the interior requires force. And so one of the things that they've seen in this one island that I showed you the picture of me getting super excited about, that famous experiment, what they found is that there was a very severe drought one year. And in the drought, most of the plants died. There was only one plant left that had any kind of seed that the finches could eat. But it was a very, very hard seed. So only the finches that happened to have deeper beaks and could apply more force to crack it open were able to get any food in order to survive. And so they survived and passed on their genes for big beaks to the next generation. And what do you get in the next generation? A lot of finches with big, deep beaks. So that's one example of how just 1 year's extreme climate situation can cause a change in a visible characteristic in those finches in just 1 year. Now you play that forward over millions of years and multiple islands, and you start to see birds on different islands adapting slightly differently to the food resources that are available based on the climate conditions and other factors. And that's what we understand it to have been.
Hi. So what you're saying that we shouldn't worry about climate change? No, the real question is, have you already noticed some change in animals or plants or?
Oh, yes. So should we worry about climate change? Yes, absolutely we should. So I'll tackle that question in two ways. So if the question is, does the ability to adapt to changing conditions mean that climate change is not a problem? I was just teaching about this in my biology class this morning, where we were talking about as the climate changes, species have essentially three options. They can do nothing, in which case they're in big trouble. Or they can adapt the way I was just describing that the finches are doing, or they can move to a new place that maybe had the conditions like the way they used to be, right? So we see species moving in the northern hemisphere to the north, right? Tracking that climate change, and on mountains moving up in elevation. So they're doing that. The question is, can they also adapt through evolutionary change? In some cases, it looks like they might be able to change rapidly enough, but in many cases, it's not rapidly enough. So the answer is they are in trouble, because if they don't move, it's unlikely that they can adapt quickly enough to keep up with the pace of evolutionary change. So they can move to new places, but of course, there's only so far you can go, right? So once you reach the top of the mountain or the northern edge of the climate, then you're out of luck.
Hi, I just wanted to come back to the point you were making about gravity on development, which is really fascinating. Is there any data on that? Because, of course, not human, but the experiments could be easily done on different models. Is there any data regarding that?
Yeah, good question. There have been a few studies that have looked at reproduction and development in a variety of different animal species, including mice, rats. We're talking about the importance of experiments on mice, and they are, of course, essential for our understanding of these types of things. But there have not yet been experiments that have gone through the entire cycle of fertilization, pregnancy, birth, development, through pregnancy again. So what it looks like is that for a low gravity environment, that certain stages of that process look like they work okay. And other stages, based on the data that we have so far, there's some big question marks. So we don't yet really know enough to be able to say, yes, it's definitely no problem. I would argue that reproduction and child development are probably the two biggest black boxes in our sort of gaps in our understanding of things that we would really need to know before we could move forward towards really saying, like, yes, settlement in these worlds is feasible. So yeah, the short answer is we know a little bit, but not nearly enough yet.
Hello, thank you again for your presentations. So I'm interested in like social structures to talk about from an evolutionary perspective. How can we expect maybe from other animals how social structures will change with this evolutionary changes? And also to reflect from the artist's perspective, how will our definitions of humanity change? And we maybe reflect on how France's position in the world has changed since World War II.
You want me to comment on how France's position on the world has changed since World War II? We are eating hamburgers now. No, what strikes me, and while Scott was commenting, is that there is a, so I'm trying to verbalize something which is very embedded within the Houston space community and doesn't fly away, which is there is a fearless curiosity to go to space, despite that there is no rational reason to go there. So my current belief, and it's not more important than one perspective out of 8 billion, is that on the theory of Scott, there is, and you're mentioning, I'm trying to use your words whereby you say there is, when there is more, the new environment is harder, so there is more variations on DNA, but there is one variations of DNA, which is it will kill us, basically. So there is, for me, to the current state of my little thinking, there is no room for us in space without a full helmet, a full space suit, and we are going to build a incredible and very flexible and very Prada-like type of space suit, but we need that at this stage. So that's, and sorry for France, I don't know how to answer more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question to think about what social organization, social structure would be like in space. And partly that depends on a lot of things that we don't know the answers to, like how many people would go, how would they be chosen, where would they live? I think a lot about the question of where would they live, what would the habitat look like? Because we know that that influences the ways in which we interact with one another, right? I mean, architects think so much about how do you design a structure, to design a building that will foster the kind of human behavior that you're trying to encourage. So having a nice room like this is great for this type of presentation and interaction. What would it be like on Mars? One of the things we know is that they would have to almost certainly have a lot of their structures be built underground for radiation protection. And I think that has important implications for social structure and social interaction, right? Because we as people, I think we would struggle with that, with being always underground, not seeing the light, not being able to see long distances, for example. And, you know, think about what happened during the pandemic when we were indoors without always the opportunity to go outside and to interact more broadly. And it stresses us out, right? I mean, that's not how we evolved to behave. And so I think it's an important question because we would have to either design spaces that would allow us to live as humans, or we're going to force people to have to change. And I don't know which of those two things we would end up doing. But I think the physical challenges that come with having to survive in those harsh conditions would have a very strong influence on what those social structures and social interactions would end up being like.
So thank you for that. I have a question for each of you. So Karim, maybe start with you. So in what you've met a lot of people in Houston, and we're always looking up. And so here you have a perspective from the Earth, looking into space and what we could do there. Have you thought about what that perspective may look like if having talked to Scott, if you were actually living on Mars, either as a human or a future human or whatever you want to call them? Have you thought about that perspective going forward?
There is a nice story who has been written by an American science fiction author in the 50s. And it is the story of people living on Mars, and they call themselves humans. And the two main characters suddenly see a ship arriving with some fire on the lower part of the ship, arriving on planet Mars. And so those humans see arriving those new aliens. And it's funny because there is not a description. I was thinking about you, Scott, while reading this novel, because there is not a description of how what is their skin, but they didn't have a helmet. And suddenly, some very ugly characters come out of this vessel which is coming, and you realize while reading the novel that those are the humans. So that's the best answer I could give you, and I'm still in this place. I'm nowhere. I'm just in a brain. So it could be you could be on the moon here watching at those two guys landing, because the way I am, there is the physicality of the world, which we are on Earth, we are on, but there is a completely infinite other world, which is the dream space, and you can set up a story anywhere. When you deal about space, it is a background. Before coming to Houston, we have asked several students from a comic school in Paris to work on space-related issues, say draw about space. And there is this very nice little story, which is that's a young student, that's a she, and Charlene said, when you go, because she did some documentations, when you go to space, there is the microgravity effect. And so there is a fluid shift. So on my story, I'm having my grandmother who's having Alzheimer. And on my story, when she goes to space, because of the fluid shift, she recovers memory. So that's the perspective I'm interested in too.
And at the risk of pushing this,
sorry, no,
it's good. I mean, again, because we do tend to have this Earth-centric perspective of what we're going to do, and this is what I think both of you are doing. Actually, you're looking at what it might be like as opposed to what we think it is like, and that's I think that's why it's always been fascinating talking to both of you. Scott, I think Karim touched on this a little bit, so maybe, but I don't know if you had a chance to respond to it. But the point being that you've looked at you're talking about the harsh environment on Mars, but at the same time, anybody who goes will be in a controlled environment. Mars isn't going to terraform for us. So we're going to be in spacesuits. We're going to be in, whether they're underground or not, we're going to be in habitats. There's going to be a temperature control. There's going to be water control. There's going to be all these different things. And I'm going to lead into something you've said before, but so how do you connect those two things when it comes to the evolution? And to give a hint of what I'd like to also hear you talk about is the microbiome comments that you've made in the past as well. And I think people would be interested in that. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So yeah, so you're right. So if we're able to control our environments as you pointed out, as we would have to do in order to have people just to be able to survive, that does mean that some of the differences in the environment on Mars wouldn't be affecting us from an evolutionary perspective. I suppose the gravitational field might still, so that might be one thing that you can't easily modify. But the radiation environment, the atmosphere, the light, all those things, perhaps we can. There's two things I'll say. The first that I'll point out is that we have a phenomenon in biology that we call the founder effect that I think is very, very relevant for thinking about space settlement. The founder effect is what happens when a small number of individuals, like the original finches, leave the mainland and go and, for whatever reason, end up on an isolated island. And it's just a small number of individuals from a larger population wherever they came from. And whatever traits and whatever genes they happen to have that they take with them, that's what sets up the new population. And it's not likely to be representative of the larger population from which they came. And more specifically, it's likely to be a lot less diverse. And so we understand that this is a common thing that happens as species settle new lands, and specifically islands. So that leads to the point that, like, we should think carefully about who gets to be the founders of a Martian civilization, right? Because the composition of those people has really important implications for the entire future of that civilization. So that's one point. But the other point that you wanted me to speak about, I think, is a really interesting thing that, in my opinion, I don't know that people have given enough thought to, which is what would happen to us as a species is only part of the story. We will bring with us, whether we realize it or not, a lot of other living things, and namely all of the microbes that we call the microbiome that live in and on our body that we now recognize are actually an essential part of what makes us who we are. We actually can't live without these microorganisms that do all sorts of important things for us, help us with digestion, immune functions, et cetera. They're coming too. They're also going to evolve. So that's part of the interesting sort of thought experiment. But the rest of it is that it's only going to be a small subset. They're going to go through their own founder effect, in that the microbes that we bring with us will only be a small subset of all the microorganisms that we normally engage with here on Earth. What happens to our immune system in that situation? Do we set ourselves up for another reason why we couldn't come back to Earth? Because the everyday bacteria in the soil or the common cold would be lethal. So that's another scenario that could cause us to have sort of an enforced separation where it would be so dangerous. And likewise, it might be dangerous for people from Earth to travel to Mars and engage with people on Mars, because they might bring microorganisms that would be deadly to the Martians. So I think that's another really important piece of the puzzle that we have to think through, is our microbial entourage that we carry with us, whether we realize it or not. And the other side of that is our immune system and what it can and can't do if it's not exposed to things that we take for granted.
All right, I'm going to end questions here just to respect everyone's time. I'm sure our speakers are happy to take some questions in person after this. So I would like to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and please join me in thanking both of our speakers.